Many of us are familiar with the story of how Alcoholics Anonymous began. The remarkable series of events that led to Bill W. meeting Dr. Bob in Akron, Ohio in 1935, sparking what would become a worldwide movement that has gone on to help millions of alcoholics. Few of us know the incredible story of how AA made its way to Australia, only the third country outside the United States and Canada. How did this happen? Australia was over 12,000 kilometres and an entire ocean away from the nearest AA meeting. There were no members to help us get started. In fact, there were very few people in this country who had even heard of AA. Today we're going to tell you the story about the men and women who were our pioneers. Wherever possible, we let them tell that story in their own words. And when that hasn't been possible, we've done our very best to stick to the facts as we understand them. We've had a lot of help to put this together from AA's dedicated historians and archivists. We've dug through libraries and rare book collections, uncovered unpublished manuscripts, searched through newspaper archives, and we've even spoken to people who remember the characters from those early days. This project has truly been a labour of love. I've been profoundly moved by the care, passion and dedication of everyone who's helped to bring this to life, including the members you'll see on stage today who have so generously poured their hearts into this work. We're glad you're here to share it with us.
We begin with the story of how AA first came to Australia, a story told through the letters exchanged between Dr. Sylvester Minogue, a psychiatrist and medical superintendent at Rydalmere Psychiatric Hospital in Sydney, and Margaret Bobby Berger, the dedicated secretary at AA's General Service Office in New York.
With World War II raging and Australia fully mobilised, in May of 1942, the American Journal of Psychiatry published an article on the treatment of chronic alcoholism by Dr. Walter A. Thompson. Dr. Thompson wrote in the Rockland State Psychiatric Hospital in Orangeburg, New York, had seen promising results getting some of their alcoholic patients to attend something called Alcoholics Anonymous. Back then, the idea of alcoholics supporting each other without doctors or professionals involved was unusual and even revolutionary. A few months later, on the 7th of December 1942, Dr. Sylvester Minogue wrote to the editor of the American Journal of Psychiatry from his residence at the Rydalmere Hospital on the banks of the Parramatta River. Dr. Minogue knew firsthand how difficult it was to get results with alcoholics. He'd spent years working in some of New South Wales' biggest psychiatric hospitals and was deeply committed to the field. It would later turn out that his interest wasn't just professional. Eventually, he would admit that he was also battling alcoholism, which made his work even more personal.
7th of December 1942. To the editor, the American Journal of Psychiatry, America. Dear Sir, I am interested in the formation of a branch of Alcoholics Anonymous in New South Wales. I would particularly like to know the steps to be taken to form such a society, its rules and organisation, how members are recruited, and once the branch having been formed, how members are kept interested. Also, and this seems to be the most difficult point for us to understand, where the treatment of acutely alcoholic members is undertaken. If a hospital is necessary, who pays the cost of its maintenance? What finance must the society have for its activities? Is this levied from the members, or does it receive state or any other assistance? All of this information, as well as any other relevant matter of literature, would be of vital interest to us. As the names and addresses of the executive officers of Alcoholics Anonymous are unknown to me, I am forwarding this letter to you, sir, confident that you will forward it on to the executive of Alcoholics Anonymous for reply. By doing so, you will receive my most grateful and appreciative thanks. Yours faithfully, Dr. Sylvester Minogue, psychiatrist, Rydalmere Hospital, New South Wales, Australia.
Dr. Minogue's letter was forwarded to AA's New York office. landing on the desk of Margaret Bobby B, the office secretary, on the 26th of January 1943. Bobby had been sober since 1939 and had taken over as AA secretary after Ruth Hock stepped down in 1942. Bobby played a key role in the handling of the flood of letters that poured in after Jack Alexander's article on AA was published in the Saturday Evening Post in March of 1941. That article helped launch AA's chaotic but crucial early growth, or adolescent phase, which eventually led to the development of the AA traditions. Despite having only a few years of sobriety herself, Bobby had remarkable insight and was a gifted communicator. She would go on to play a big part in bringing AA to Australia. On the 2nd of February 1943, she replied to Dr. Minogue, sending him a detailed information on how AA meetings and groups worked. She also enclosed a copy of Alcoholics Anonymous, our big book, and instructions on how to start a meeting.
February 2nd, 1943. To Dr. Silver Minogue, psychiatrist, Rydalmere Hospital, New South Wales, Australia. Dear Sir, your letter of December 7th, 1942, addressed to the editor of the Journal of Psychiatry, has been sent on to us. We will be happy to cooperate in any way that we can towards establishing a group in New South Wales. We are a society of some 8,000 alcoholics who have recovered through the principles of AA. We claim no cure, knowing that we are, and always will be, alcoholics in the sense that we may never drink anything. However, we have found that with the personality change brought on by living according to a suggested program, the 12 steps, we can return to a normal, happy life without fear of taking that first drink. Potential members may be found everywhere. We hear of them through doctors, clergymen, social services organizations, and personal contact. Groups are self-supporting. Most groups pass the hat at meetings to pay for their local expenses like rent, heat, and other incidentals. No member ever benefits from these collections. Our work is entirely avocational. Our central office in New York is supported by voluntary contributions of members all over the country, which averages about $1 every year per member. We suggest that 2 or 3 men who want to recover get together and read the literature. With this small start, a group can be said to have begun. In a very short time, a matter of days or weeks, they, in turn, can seek out help and others to help. As soon as weekly meetings are held, the book and 12 steps may be discussed as topics to build up an interesting meeting. Later, personal experiences and everyday problems may be used to start discussion. The whole program is in the 12 steps. It can be successful with one or with an unlimited number. Physicians often give a group its start by helping with the first few meetings. From this point on, the alcoholics invariably want to take over, so do not be surprised if they are a little insistent about this.
This marked the beginning of a correspondence between Bobby B and Dr. Minogue that would eventually lead to the establishment of Alcoholics Anonymous in Australia. Over the next few years, Dr. Minogue worked closely with Father Thomas Dunlea, an Irish Catholic priest best known for founding Boys Town during the Great Depression. Despite their efforts, nothing really took off until 1945, when they were joined by a third man, a non-alcoholic psychiatric nurse from the Darlinghurst Reception House called Archie McKinnon. In January of 1944, the American Journal of Psychiatry then published an article entitled Therapeutic Mechanisms of Alcoholics Anonymous by psychiatrist Dr. Harry Thibault. The article introduced AA to the medical and scientific world, explaining its key ideas. Dr. Thibault highlighted the importance of ego deflation and surrender as central to the approach of AA's recovery. The article caught the attention of Archie McKinnon. Like Dr. Minogue before him, he wrote to the American Journal of Psychiatry asking for more information about AA. Once again, this request was passed along to Bobby B in New York. On the 15th of September 1944, Bobby B responded, sending Archie a copy of the Big Book and encouraging him to contact Dr. Minogue, explaining that Minogue had already been working to establish AA in Australia. Archie received Bobby's letter in early 1945 and, following her advice, got in touch with Dr. Minogue. Soon, Archie, Dr. Minogue and Father Tom Dunlea teamed up, and their efforts finally paid off in March 1945. That's when they brought together the first known members of Alcoholics Anonymous in Australia: Ben Booth, a returned soldier and pharmacist; Wally, a dapper window dresser; and Rex Armitage, a man from a privileged background who had lost everything through his drinking.
Our next scene tells the story of the very first alcoholics in Australia to find hope and recovery through the AA program. Just a few decades earlier, one of Australia's most celebrated writers, Henry Lawson, had followed the all too familiar path of alcoholism, enduring repeated stints in prison and psychiatric hospitals, including Darlinghurst Reception House, which would later play an important role in the AA's early history in this country. Tragically, Lawson's life ended in poverty and an early death. For many at the time, that seemed the only fate available. But with the arrival of AA, something had changed. For the first time, there was a way out.
My name's Rex and I'm an alcoholic. My father, this is probably where I'll start, H.T. Armitage Esquire, CMG, was the governor of the Commonwealth Bank. He was the one who signed the banknotes. He was very important and he never let me forget it. I suppose I was afforded all of the privileges that someone could afford. You know, I had great schools and a name that opened doors everywhere I went. But they'd soon slam shut once they realised who they were dealing with. I started drinking at 18, and by 32, I'd lost everything, including a wife and child who had just simply had enough. I'd tried many things: rider, swag man, jackaroo. I was in the Army Medical Corps during World War II. But above all, I was what they called a dipsomaniac. It's a hopeless drunk. My time in the medical corps had been good to me. I'd always been well fed, well bedded, well dressed, and all my thinking had been done for me. I was a non-commissioned officer, so the soldiers looked up to me, and the officers respected me. And as a pre-war hobo, I'd been an outcast, even by my own family. As the time of my release approached, I was worried. I knew that drinking drugs had beat me, of that I had no doubt. So it was. On the day of my release in 1945, I went on a colossal bender, which ended with a severe bout of the DTs at my apartment in King's Cross, terrified that I'd throw myself out the window. A couple of nights of abject fear and unspeakable terror before I was accepted into Darlinghurst Reception House for the second time. I knew drinking drugs would have me. I knew it. And my time in there, after about 2 weeks, I knew they'd lock me up in a small room. You know, drinking drugs had me so beat that it was better than the torture of drinking. I was a hopeless alcoholic. And after about 2 weeks in there, I started to feel a bit physically better. But I knew as soon as I hit Civvy Street, I was going to be overwhelmed. I didn't want to be a hobo again. I wanted to take my place in life as a normal, respectable, conventional person, but I couldn't. I couldn't. Drinking drugs had me so ensnared that they were going to ruin me. And what could be done about it? Nothing. Nothing at all. Absolutely nothing. To all appearances, I was a man without a future, unless the bleak prospect stretching out before me could be called a future. It was whilst in this frame of mind that I was sitting on a bench in the exercise yard when one of the blue uniform attendants approached. He was a man of similar size and stature to me, and of all of the attendants going on and coming off duty, I'd scarcely recognised him. His name, he told me, was Archie McKinnon. This man, although I couldn't come to know it, would be the man to relieve me from bondage. We started talking, just small talk really, and then he turned to me with his intelligent face and his deep-set blue eyes locking onto mine. And then came the question, the one that I had heard so many times before.
Rex, have you thought about giving away the drink and the drugs? Of leading a normal, useful life?
Archie, I think of little else these days, mate. But I don't see how I can do it. Is there an answer to my problem?
Yes, there is. Have you heard of Alcoholics Anonymous?
What's that? Archie handed me a big black book. It said Alcoholics Anonymous, but didn't hold any author's name on it.
Read it, Rex. I won't be on duty again until the day after tomorrow, and then we can have a chat about it. The answer to your problems lie in that book.
I read it once, and then I read it again. It was filled with stories of men and women, people just like me, hopeless drunks who had recovered. As soon as I put it down, my frustration and my depression had vanished. I now knew that there was hope for me. It was filled with stories of people worse than me or just as bad as me who had recovered, so why shouldn't I? The next time I saw Archie, I walked straight up to him and I said, I've read the book and I want to join Alcoholics Anonymous. Imagine my disappointment when he said that AA wasn't yet in Australia. But he quickly dispelled that.
I know at least two other men. A pharmacist called Ben and a window dresser named Wally. They're alcoholics like you who are interested in AA and in starting it here. I'm going to make contact with Ben and arrange for him to pick you up from here when you're released, okay?
And then Reception House turned me loose on an unsuspecting world. It was on a warmish day in March 1945, and I didn't let the humidity drag me into any pubs on the way. I went straight to my YMCA, the hotel on Pitt Street, and I booked a single room with a small window overlooking the light well. I was starting to feel a glimmer of hope. At 5:30 p.m, I met Ben B outside the Sydney Hotel in the city, and Ben was a pharmacist and an ex-serviceman, and he was the first one to fully embrace the AA program in Australia. Ben's the one that taught me the principles of AA. We caught a train out to Sutherland, to see Father Tom Dunley. Now, Father Dunley, I found him to be a laughing, cheerful Irishman of palpable sincerity. But I couldn't help but thinking, he's a bit of a dreamer. You know, he had some really big ideas. But I soon found out that Father Tom Dunley was the type of person who needed and got the help of practical men to put his ideas into action. And that's how it was with Boys Town. The next day, we caught the train to Rydalmere Psychiatric Hospital. We went straight up the back to the 2-storey brick building of the medical superintendent, Dr. Sylvester J. Minogue. Doc Minogue opened the door and I found him a kindly man, all right? Grey hair, moustache, but I've never met a psychiatrist less like a psychiatrist in my life, both in manner and appearance. His hair was all awry, his moustache was lopsided, he was wearing grey bogs, tweed suit and slippers. And he led us into the drawing room, his comfortably furnished drawing room, I might add. And in there we had Archie and a small, melancholic-looking little fellow, impeccably dressed in a green suit and matching accessories, and that was Wally the window washer. It was a beautiful night we spent there. There was a piano in the drawing room, and before long, I found myself on the piano. Archie had brought his violin. So we played the Norwegian cradle song. Cavalleria Ruscatana Overture. The Question. And the answer. The psychiatrist, the priest, the mental attendant, the alcoholic chemist, and the alcoholic window washer, and the alcoholic me.
Sometime between the 15th and the 19th of March 1945, a small gathering took place in the drawing room of Dr. Minogue's residence on the banks of the Parramatta River at Rydalmere Psychiatric Hospital. It may not have looked like a typical AA meeting by today's standards, but it was the first known meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous in Australia. The very first link in a chain that has continued unbroken to this day. On the 1st of March 1945, Dr. Minogue wrote to Bobby B.
Dear Madam, after very many trials, difficulties and disappointments, during which time I did not have the courage to answer your letters because I could report no progress, I'm now very happy to report that a branch of Alcoholics Anonymous has formed in Sydney.
Rydalmere Hospital proved impractical for regular meetings, and venues were very difficult to come by. In the early days, members would often stroll the streets of King's Cross with me in the evening. We'd find a cafe, take over a booth, and discuss AA late into the night. One such place was the Hasty Tasty in King's Cross, an American-style diner that served as a refuge for Sydney's nocturnal inhabitants, including this newly formed group of sober, hopeful alcoholics. It was there where we took our first tentative steps towards understanding what the AA program was about. How was the spiritual part of the program to be carried out? Did people have to get religion? I was as confused as they were.
It would be nice to think that everything ran smoothly once AA got started in Australia, but that wasn't the case. While Rex managed to stay sober and dedicate himself to spreading the message of recovery, both Ben and Wally struggled and started drinking again. Despite numerous challenges, Rex became the cornerstone of early AA in Australia. He tirelessly carried the message to newcomers, persevering until a stable nucleus of the fellowship had formed. His efforts played a foundational role in the establishment of AA in Australia. Letters between Dr. Minogue and Bobby B show that, just like in the United States, the early fellowship here faced plenty of growing pains. There was very little AA literature available, thanks to wartime import restrictions. There were leadership struggles and arguments about whether AA needed to be adapted for less religious Australians. At times, people came along not for recovery, but to take advantage of the group's generosity, especially from Father Tom Dunlea, who was known for being a bit of a soft touch. And just like the story of Middleton in the 12 and 12, Australia had its own ambitious group who set up an alcoholic foundation. Backed by well-meaning wealthy supporters and AA members, they dreamed of building a hospital, a recovery home and a clubhouse. But these plans created big tensions, and in the end, most of them fell apart. Still, despite all the challenges, AA in Australia held on, and slowly but surely it kept growing. In 1946, Dr. Minogue wrote an apologetic letter to Bobby B, seeking to explain the Australian Fellowship's apparent failings and detailing the various plans and schemes that had been attempted. Still grappling with the principles of Alcoholics Anonymous, he seemed to invite what he clearly believed would be a well-deserved reprimand for the group's missteps.
Things here with AA are not half so bad or disloyal as you in America have the right to believe from our letters. The one thing binding them together is their desire to get well and their gratitude to AA and to yourself, who have so patiently put up with our foibles. I would take it that we are nothing else but a troublesome children who want to do the right thing, but with our inexperience, our enthusiasm, we unmindingly cause worry and anxiety to you in America, to whom we owe all. All we require at times is a gentle rebuke, and we will come to heel.
Now, Bobby B's response on the 22nd of May was a classic example of the spirit of Alcoholics Anonymous. Warm, insightful, and filled with shared experience, her letter reflects the common struggles and lessons learned in the early days of AA, both in the United States and abroad.
Bill Wilson, who anonymously wrote our book and was the first AA member, and I so enjoyed your recent letter of January 5th. Bill and I were amazed at the similarity between your early experiences, the trials and errors, and our early ones 10 years ago in America. Your story could easily have been ours. We all went through the same organizational difficulties, differences of opinion, over-conservatism, and over-promotionalism. Our foundation thought of setting up hospitals, thought of going into business, thought of educational programs ad infinitum. And it was only after several years that they realized the wisdom of not complicating AA with business affiliations. Hence our policy now of sticking simply to the basic AA principles of having but one aim, to help the sick alcoholic recover if he wishes.
Over the next couple of years, new AA members and their partners, as well as a number of non-alcoholic friends, joined AA. They would do a great deal to help bring stability and unity to our fellowship. Some of these were Fred and Eileen E., who went on to start the Manly meeting, Clive and Lorna B., who ran the first office from their home and were instrumental in getting our first office started off the ground. Russell and Dorothy, Jim the journalist, and non-alcoholic friends, including well-known presenter Frank Sturge Hardy and Jesuit priest Father Richard Murphy. Each state and territory had its own non-alcoholic friends who played a vital role in early Australia, just as they had done in the USA.
In 1947, Alcoholics Anonymous made its way out of Sydney for the first time. With the establishment of the Fitzroy Group that same year, Australia would be visited by American celebrity Lillian Roth. Lillian's promising stage and screen career had been derailed by alcoholism, but with the help of AA, she was on the road to recovery. Lillian was destined to create a sensation in Australia, putting Alcoholics Anonymous firmly on the map.
In 1946, Don Wilding from the Brotherhood of St Lawrence in Melbourne came to Sydney and attended Alcoholics Anonymous meetings in Vianney House in Surrey Hills, or the old pub as it was affectionately known by members. Impressed by Wilding's report, the Brotherhood of St Lawrence then arranged to fly me and Ron Fitz to Melbourne to help start AA there. At the Fitzroy headquarters of the Brotherhood, a line-up was conducted every morning and meal tickets were given to applicants, most of whom were alcoholic. The Monday morning following our arrival, Ron and I were on the line-up. We attended the line-up, seeing it as an opportunity, a potential opportunity to search for suitable prospects for AA. While most of the men did not seem interested in AA, one man, Don H, appeared to be paying attention. Ron and I sat down with Don and we spoke with him about alcoholism and AA, though we were unsure whether our message was getting through. But Don, worn down and receptive to new ideas, had a spectacular and profound change in his attitude and his behaviour. A type of transformation occasionally witnessed in AA. The Brotherhood of St Lawrence got Don a job and helped him get back on his feet again, and Don became the founding member of the Fitzroy Group. From that point onward, Don remained sober and never missed another day of work. Shortly after, in January 1947, Russ J and his wife Dorothy travelled to Melbourne, staying for 3 weeks. When they returned to Sydney, a group of 8 members had formed, including Don, became the Fitzroy Group under the auspices of the Brotherhood of St Lawrence.
The Fitzroy meeting was run by Don Wilding, a social worker from the Brotherhood. He wasn't an alcoholic himself. He was a former Sydney policeman and agnostic, but he believed, like some of Sydney's early AA members, that the program needed to be adjusted for Australian alcoholics. Just like the tensions bubbling away in the Sydney Fellowship and in parts of AA over in the US, Don Wilding felt that here in Australia, AA needed to ease up on all the talk about God and spiritual awakenings. He believed we should place more emphasis on the psychological angle instead. Others felt strongly that Australians should stick to the AA program as it set out in the Big Book, without playing down the spirituality of the program. These tensions would come to a head in Melbourne with the arrival of American actress and newly sober member Lillian Roth. The story of Alcoholics Anonymous in Australia cannot be told without acknowledging the incredible impact of Lillian Roth's visit in 1947. This was a turning point that changed everything for AA in Australia. At that stage, AA had barely moved out of Sydney and was beset by problems and conflicts which, as Bobby B pointed out, were very familiar to Bill Wilson and AA in the USA. This period could well be described as Australia's own adolescent period. In June of 1947, 34-year-old American screen star Lillian Roth was just 6 months sober and recently married to fellow AA member Bert McGuire. Once a glamorous fixture of Hollywood, she'd fallen hard due to alcoholism, losing her wealth, career, and reputation. Now she was struggling to rebuild her life. The public and the entertainment industry remained sceptical, having seen her relapse time and time again. Many doubted her ability to stay sober, let alone stage a comeback. She was struggling both financially and emotionally. It was then that an unexpected offer came through.
For the first time in my sobriety, I felt almost despondent. Once again, it seemed I'd hit a stone wall. But then, an invitation arrived. The Tivoli Theatrical Circuit in Melbourne, Australia, offered me a 6-month tour through Australia and New Zealand. So I boarded the ship in San Francisco with my husband, Bert, bound for Australia. And during the voyage, I got talking with Reverend William James, a Melbourne minister who was on his way home after a trip to the United States. As we chatted, I shared my story, how drinking had nearly ruined my life, and how I'd found sobriety in AA just 10 months earlier. I asked if he'd be willing to spread the word about AA to his congregation. Before I left Australia, my AA friends had stressed to me that working with other alcoholics was essential if I wanted to stay sober. So I also asked if he knew of any alcoholics he could send my way. Well, the Reverend responded with a half smile. I have one back home I'll give you as a gift. I can't do anything with him, and he drinks up all my collection box. God help him. He's been a hopeless drunk for 20 years.
As the saying goes, be careful what you wish for. This recently sober alcoholic from New York, along with her husband Bert, would go on to carry the AA message to hundreds, if not thousands, of Australian alcoholics with extraordinary dedication, doing frontline 12-step work of the most selfless kind. Along the way, Lillian broke her anonymity, which did attract some criticism, but it's worth remembering the context. She was still quite new to AA herself, far from home, and arrived at a time when the traditions weren't yet well established in Australia. Even so, there's no question about the impact she had. Many of Australia's early sober members either found AA through the publicity surrounding her visit or were 12th stepped directly by Lillian herself.
We'd been only a few days in Melbourne, where I opened at the Tivoli Theatre, when the doorman rapped on my dressing room. Distaste was written all over his face. There's someone called Jack, and he says the Reverend Mr. James sent him to see you. So at the stage door was an emaciated, unhappy man. His frayed sleeves were too short. His trousers looked as if they'd been taken from a rubbish heap, and the soles of his shoes flapped. He stood there shaking. He managed to get out a few words. The Reverend said, "You could help me, ma'am, and I need help very badly." This man's name was Jack, and he would be the first of many alcoholics who would seek our help. He was still so shaky that we offered him a drink, which helped him calm a little. Now, I was due on stage in 10 minutes, but we had to keep an eye on Jack and keep him under surveillance. He had to be talked to, watched, comforted. So adjoining our dressing room was that of a dance team called Cabot and Dresden. Married couple, and they'd been so sweet with us. So I hurried into their room and I said, "You must do something for us. We have an alcoholic in a bad way in our room, and I'm due on stage now, and Bert has to stand in the wings. Would you pretend you're alcoholics?" "Of course they would," said Mrs. Cabot. So she led our friend into their room and began unfolding the most fantastic story of alcoholism I've ever heard. Later, we gave Jack $1, told him to return whenever he wished. We knew he'd buy liquor with it, but he couldn't buy much. And he'd be back. We were trying to do what had been done for us not so long ago when we got sober. But we didn't have the benefit of other AA members to help, so we just had to make do. So the next day, Jack returned, and this time with another man. Now, we realized the two men likely believed they'd found an easy source of money and a free drink, but we didn't mind. We got to work. I handed the newcomer some money and asked if he'd take Jack to dinner and make sure he didn't drink. And then meanwhile, Bert spoke to Jack, giving him similar instructions to watch the newcomer and ensure he stayed sober. 2 hours later, they returned, reporting very happy with themselves that neither of the other had drunk. So from that point on, we kept one man with Cabot and Dresden, the other alcoholics, new, and the other one sat in a box watching the show, and that ensured that neither of them could sneak a drink. Meanwhile, a third candidate arrived. The word was out. By the week's end, we were dealing with 6 alcoholics, and I had myself an AA nucleus. Presently, we were holding meetings in our dressing room. Alcoholics were with us sometimes until 3 a.m. We spoke with them for hours. We went through the DTs with them. We walked miles with them, poured black coffee into them. What had been done for us, and for me nearly 10 months ago, and Bert 2 years before that, we were now doing for them.
In the midst of all this, the Reverend Clarence Irving Benson called on Lillian and Bert. Reverend Benson was closely associated with the Oxford Group and had authored an influential book, The 8 Points of the Oxford Group, in 1936. He was already very familiar with AA, having reviewed the big book in his weekly column in the Melbourne Herald in 1942.
So Reverend Benson invited me to speak openly about my drinking and recovery in AA on his nationally broadcast radio show, A Pleasant Sunday Afternoon. I told him I didn't want to break my anonymity. But after a brief pause, he looked at me and he said, "Lillian, please do think it over. There are instruments in the Lord's work, and you may well have been chosen to be such an instrument. The criticism you may receive from a small minority must be measured against the help you will give to countless others who will be hearing you."
After that, Lillian agreed and shared her story. By doing so, she broke her anonymity, which, as predicted, drew some criticism, including a gentle rebuke from Bill W. Nevertheless, the broadcast created a national sensation and had a profound impact on the development of AA in Australia. Listeners all over the country were captivated by the account of her 15 years of active alcoholism, which only came to an end when she found AA. Following the broadcast, Lillian and her husband Bert were inundated with pleas for help. They worked tirelessly to respond, and the publicity provided a significant boost to AA, not only in Melbourne, but nationally.
The results were staggering. We were inundated with hundreds of telegrams, letters, invitations to speak. Alcoholics converged upon our stage door. As long a line waited there as waited outside the Tivoli Theatre box office in the front of the theatre. But in the queue backstage, there were weeping mothers and wives, sometimes entire families, praying that we could help their sons and husbands. From waking until sleeping, we had no rest, either at the theatre or in our hotel.
One of the people in the live audience at the Wesley Church during the broadcast was Harold J., who at 30 years old had been drinking for half of his life. After hearing Lillian Roth speak, Harold took up her invitation to make an appointment to talk with them at their hotel. The Reverend Gordon Powell, who remained a good friend of AA in Melbourne for the rest of his life, recalled Harold's visit with Lillian.
Lillian agreed to talk to Harold while she got ready for her Wednesday matinee performance at the Tivoli in Burke Street. My associate, Norman Lay, arrived with Harold, still drunk as a lord, weaving his way up Collins Street and around the stage door of the Tivoli. He went in, and a row of chorus girls looked in astonishment at my dog collar. But, oh boy, they weren't half as astonished as I was at their lack of dog collars, or anything else for that matter.
Lillian then told Harold the story of how she had made $1 million before she was 21 and had lost it all through her drinking. She then asked Harold,
"So, Harold, you say you've had a drinking problem for 15 years? That's exactly the same length of time I had my problem. If I can beat it, you can too."
If ever I saw hope born in a man's eyes, I saw hope born that day.
On the 13th of October 1947, a meeting was held at the Independent Hall on Collins Street, marking the official founding of the Melbourne group of Alcoholics Anonymous. Among those present were Lillian and Bert, Reverend Dr. Gordon Powell, Church Secretary Norman Lay, and several alcoholics who'd been helped by the Maguires, including Harold J., who would play a key role in AA's growth in Melbourne. In a letter to Bill W. and Bobby B. on October 16, 1947, Lillian wrote,
To Bobby and Bill, from Lillian. Happy to report that we have a fine group started here, and with the full support of various churches of many denominations. They've sent their cases to us, as have several doctors in the city. We couldn't work with Donald W. He openly announced he was an agnostic and did not follow the 12 steps. He's had no success to date. Reverend Benson and Father Fox have asked Bert and I to open and organize a group of Alcoholics Anonymous. The independent church has given us the use of its room until AA can fund its own. We have about 18 men and a few women.
A year later, 8 of the original 12 members of the Melbourne group remained active, and bi-weekly meetings were drawing approximately 60 attendees. Harold J. became a driving force in Melbourne AA in the early years. Eventually, the Fitzroy group closed. However, both Archie McKinnon and Russ J. reported that the original Fitzroy group member, Don H., remained sober.
Alcoholics Anonymous next found its way to South Australia in October 1947, carried along by the momentum of Lillian Roth's visit. Fresh from sharing her story in Melbourne, Lillian arrived in Adelaide and before long was standing before a packed audience at the Adelaide Town Hall.
My name's Billy and I'm an alcoholic. Flaming heck, hi yourself. I'm here to tell you the story of how Alcoholics Anonymous came to Adelaide in 1947. It's a story that saved my life and the lives of many others. I started out in Inverell, New South Wales, and moved to Victoria with my family as a young man. My father was a Church of Christ minister and my mother was the church organist. I developed quite an aptitude for music myself. There was never any alcohol or smoking in our family. Later, when we were living in Victoria, I used to pop across the street each week to the church when the cleaning lady was working. She used to tip all the leftover communion wine from the small glasses into one big glass and give it to me to drink. I've often wondered if that was the start of my alcoholic drinking. We moved to South Australia, and by the time I was 17, I'd become a professional musician, playing violins and drums in dance bands. Musos have always had a bit of a thing for booze, and I was no exception. By 1928, I was working at the State Theatre in Victoria, playing violin, guitar and saxophone. But then came the Great Depression, and by 1929, the talking pictures had arrived. Suddenly, there was no need for orchestras anymore, so I went back to Adelaide and started playing dance bands again, and brother, what a life that was. I needed alcohol just to handle the pressure of the late nights and the long hours. For a while, alcohol was my servant, and I managed to keep things ticking along. But I was slowly losing ground, and before long, the servant became the master. I was heading for the pit. The hangovers dragged on, one into the next, over and over again. Alcohol had me completely in its vice-like grip. I was absolutely powerless to control my drinking. How the hell do I get out of this, I thought. Then, by chance, I read about this thing called AA in America, and in 1947, deliverance was finally at hand. Lillian Roth and her husband Bert were in Australia, and like a drowning man, I grabbed the chance to contact her in Melbourne. To my amazement, on the 1st of October in 1947, she wrote back.
Dear Billy, as we say in AA, you are in as long as you express the desire to quit. Our first step is to admit that our lives have become unmanageable. We're not a religious group, but a spiritual one. That is, a man may come in agnostic, but after he's in for a while, he himself admits to a power greater than himself, God as he understands it. Collaborate with God. You don't need wings to do this, just a simple belief in a power greater than yourself, God as you understand him. God gave you bread, but you got to butter it. You have a disease, as the diabetic does. He can't take sugar and you can't take alcohol. So boy, don't pick up that first drink. You keep an open mind and you'll be a happy man before long. Forgive my typing, I'm teaching myself. Tough on you. Easy does it. First things first. Live and let live. Good luck, Lillian Roth.
I wrote to Lillian a few more times and received encouraging replies. I have kept them and treasured them. The publicity around Lillian's visit to Melbourne also caught the attention of Reverend George White from the Methodist Mission here in Adelaide. He invited her to Adelaide to speak at a public meeting, and to her great credit, Lillian took time out of her busy schedule of performances to do this vital 12-step work. The event was held at Adelaide Town Hall on Sunday the 19th of October in 1947, and it was broadcast to a wider audience. Lillian and her husband Bert Maguire were only in Adelaide for 5 days, but in that short time they made a lasting impact, raising awareness about AA and helping to get things started here in South Australia. When Lillian arrived in Adelaide, I met her and Bert and spent some time learning about AA. Chances are the very first AA meeting in South Australia took place right there in Lillian and Bert's hotel room. Just like in Melbourne, the media quickly picked up on Lillian's involvement with AA. She was invited to speak at various church services, and alcoholics began getting in touch with her, Reverend White, and hoping for the chance to meet her. Her town hall appearance even made the front page of the Advertiser on Monday the 20th of October 1947. The paper reported that Lillian spoke to a full house, delivering a message that really struck a chord with people.
Nobody can help an alcoholic like another alcoholic. You've been down in the pit yourself and you know how they feel. You can talk their language. Not long ago, I had hit that bottom, and only alcoholics know. I had money, fame, everything, but it slipped through my fingers because alcohol had become an obsession. Then Alcoholics Anonymous came to my rescue. Alcoholics Anonymous does not ask an alcoholic to promise to give up liquor for the rest of your lives. We only ask that person desirous of help to abstain on a 24-hour basis, because it's the present that matters, not the future or the past. You cannot hope to cure an alcoholic by willpower any more than you can hope to cure a diabetic through willpower. Insulin is a cure for diabetics, but there's no medicine yet that can cure alcoholism. Meanwhile, Alcoholics Anonymous is the missing link. The only movement which, because its members were alcoholics once themselves, can offer real help. We're not here to perform miracles. There's no cure for alcoholism, but there is a way out. If we can find only one man in Adelaide with a sincere desire to stop drinking, then from him, AA can mushroom, just as it did in America.
After Lillian's town hall talk, it wasn't long before she and Bert were flooded with requests for help again. Just like they'd done in Melbourne, they spent much of their time meeting with alcoholics. One of those men was Arthur, who he later came to know fondly as Adelaide Arthur. He went on to help get the very first AA group in South Australia off the ground. The first official AA meeting in Adelaide was held the very next day on Monday the 20th of October 1947 at the Methodist Mission. 16 men and 2 women turned up, and just like that, the first AA group in South Australia was born. Lillian and Bert were there, and we selected a chairperson and agreed to meet twice a week. The early members were a real mix of people from all walks of life. Adelaide Arthur was one of the originals, along with Meredith M., who had spent time in Sydney learning about AA. There was Alf G., better known as Bowtie Alf, and John, a retired Army Major. Pauline was a school teacher, and Mulga Bill owned a station way up north. Motorbike Alf worked as a storeman, and Betty H. as a library assistant. Edward and George were both radio announcers, while Salisbury Bill managed a store. Captain Bob was around in those early days too, as was Lucy L., a wealthy divorcee. Not long before, every one of us had been struck in that same awful place, lost in the loneliness and despair of alcoholism, thinking we were beyond hope. We were cut off from the lives we'd known, drowning in our own struggles. But that night, something changed. We came together, brought by the same need and the same simple promise that maybe, just maybe, there was a way out. I hope you all enjoy this celebration of AA's history, and I wish you all the joy and happiness that AA brought to me. And remember, easy does it. First things first. Live and let live. Good luck.
We're going to take a 5-minute break, just quickly go to the toilet and come back, because we've now got the rest of Australia to tell you about. So just 5 minutes and we're going to be back. Thank you.
One of the most incredible tales of AA's establishment in Australia is the story of how it got to Western Australia, one of the most remote places on earth. It is a story of love and powerful determination against staggering odds, and the vital role that Bunbury Jim and Gwen, with the help of their community, played in early AA in Australia.
Jim W., known as Bunbury Jim, and I were instrumental in establishing AA in Western Australia. Jim's descent into the abyss, as he calls it, began around 1927 and continued during the Great Depression until he got sober in 1947. During the Great Depression, Jim became a compulsive and uncontrollable drinker. While it was clear to the rest of us, he didn't seem to fully realise just how serious his drinking had become. The alcoholic always seems to be the last to know. He would seem to disappear, he would just sometimes disappear for days, and we didn't know where he was or whether he was dead or alive. On one occasion, Jim had a drink out just outside Bunbury and came to in Kalgoorlie, 560 kilometres from where he started, with no memory of how he got there. He was president of the RSL at the time, and he had to resign in shame. Jim was constantly in trouble with the police, employers, and his family. We were worried sick because of his drinking. Over the years, he sometimes managed to stay sober for short stretches. At one point, he even stayed dry for 2 years after going to church. But eventually, he had a few drinks and the compulsion came roaring back. Within weeks, he was right back where he started, or worse. No matter how hard I tried to help him, every attempt to keep him sober ended in failure. In 1947, the doctors in Bunbury were saying that Jim might have to be committed to the Claremont Psychiatric Hospital for his own good. They didn't know what else to do. Around this time, our local doctor, John Flynn, came across an article in the Australian Medical Journal about the success AA was having in Sydney and told us about it. I immediately wrote to the British Medical Association offices in Sydney and Melbourne, eventually receiving a list of doctors. One of them was Dr. Sylvester Minogue, a name Dr. Flynn recognised from the article. Everyone agreed that Jim would be a good candidate for AA, but how to get him to Sydney? We were struggling financially, especially with 9 children to care for. A trip across the country with no income coming in seemed impossible. In 1947, Jim took his last drink. The local Returned Soldiers League eventually stepped in, loaning Jim and I the money needed to make the journey. Meanwhile, I faced the huge challenge of finding care for our 9 children during this period. Because Jim was newly sober, we thought it was important I make it with him, make the trip with him. We made arrangements for the older kids. However, the 2 younger children were put in a home for 6 weeks. With a letter of recommendation from Dr. Flynn, we set off by train for Sydney, arriving in 1947. Once there, Jim jumped into AA straight away.
Fabulous.
I attended my first AA meeting at the North Sydney group at Mater Hospital, where I was introduced to Dr. Minogue. He gave me the contact details of two other AA members, Clive B. from North Sydney and Fred E. from Manly. Clive became my sponsor, and before long, I was regularly attending meetings in Manly, North Sydney and Burwood. I have very fond memories of those early days, meeting some of the pioneering AA members, Clive B., Fred E., Dr. Minogue, Lloyd R., Ozzie W., Jim S. and Russ J. I also met two non-alcoholic friends of AA, Frank Sturge Hardy, better known as Sturge, and Father Richard Murphy. Both of them left a lasting impression on me. They were Australia's equivalent of the early non-alcoholic supporters of AA in the USA, like Dr. Samuel Shoemaker and Father Edward Darling. While Gren returned home after 6 weeks, I stayed in Sydney for 3 months, immersing myself in the AA program. Just before I left, I found out that I had passed a public service exam, which meant I could have stayed in Sydney and taken a job, but the AA members there encouraged me to return to Western Australia and help get AA started. Inspired by the results already achieved in New South Wales, I was determined to carry the message from the wise men in the East to the drunks of the West. I travelled home by ship, making a brief stop in Melbourne, where I met Lillian Roth and Bert Maguire. I even had the opportunity to help with some 12-step work before continuing my journey back to Western Australia. Once I got home, I contacted the West Australian newspaper, and they allowed me to write a 500-word piece about AA. This was published on the 28th of October, 1947. Only one person replied, Bill S., but he would go on to become the first secretary of AA in the state. Years later, many people told me they had cut the article out and put it in the drawer to save. The first Alcoholics Anonymous meeting in Western Australia was held at the Manse in Claremont in late 1947. Among the early attendees were Dr. Laycott Sr., who became a vital ally of AA, and Jim H., who would go on to become a dedicated member. By April 1948, AA groups had been established in both Perth and Bunbury. Bunbury with 2 or 3 sober members, and Perth with about 5. Brian King, an Anglican non-alcoholic minister in Bunbury, and his parishioners were strong supporters of AA in those early days. They not only attended meetings, but also helped members find work and provide lifts to meetings. On one occasion, the Bunbury police received a call from their counterparts in Kalgoorlie about a very sick alcoholic in need of help. Brian King drove the long distance to Kalgoorlie, brought the man back to Bunbury, cared for him, and then brought him to a meeting where local members took over. In those early years, members would drop in on each other for a cuppa and a chat, and the small group often gathered for picnics. Owen O and Gerberjack were 2 other key members in the southwest who helped lay the foundation for the fellowship in WA. Today, Alcoholics Anonymous in Western Australia has grown into a vibrant community with thousands of members. There are now 188 meetings each week across the state, and the fellowship continues to grow, carrying the message of recovery to those who still suffer.
The vital contribution of women in AA's early history in Australia cannot be overstated. Where would we have been without the dedication and exceptional communication skills of Bobby B in New York, Then there was the extraordinary role played by Lillian Roth. Closer to home, the wives of our first members were absolutely crucial. In those early days, they usually came along to meetings with their husbands, offering plenty of support and often some firm encouragement to keep showing up. It was also a woman, Lorna B., who helped lay the groundwork for AA's first successful office. She and her husband Clive ran the office from their own home, and in those early years, it was Lorna who spent countless hours answering calls from alcoholics looking for help. And it wasn't long before women started joining AA as members themselves. Very few of our early pioneers arrived on horseback, but Betty H., known to many as Ginger Betty, came pretty close. Betty became the first woman in Australia to join AA in 1946.
We lived out on a few acres out in Sutherland, my husband Guy and me and our three girls. There was nothing I loved more than getting out for a few hours on my horse and just riding around the district and clearing my head. It was out on one of those rides that I first ran into Father Tom Dunley, the local priest. I soon discovered he lived in the same street as me. Now, me being Protestant and him being Catholic, you mightn't think we'd have much to do with each other, but we hit it off. We both enjoyed getting out on horseback, and before long we were riding together pretty regularly while he did his rounds. Looking back, maybe we recognised something in each other. Turns out we were both alcoholics, though neither of us were ready to admit it at that time. We used to visit the metho camps around Sutherland. Father Tom used to talk about alcoholics quite a lot. He'd mentioned this new fellowship that had started up in America called Alcoholics Anonymous, and of a psychiatrist named Dr. Minogue, who he'd been working with to try to get AA started in Australia. It all sounded pretty interesting, but I wasn't quite ready to think it might apply to me. In 1944, Father Tom started up a camp in Sutherland for Skid Row drunks, and I helped out by doing the catering. Poor Father Tom. He was still trying to figure out what might help these blokes, and one of his bright ideas was to give them good liquor instead of the metho they'd been drinking. Well, you can probably guess how all that turned out. The whole thing descended into chaos. The police got involved and the camp was shut down. After that, I drifted away from Father Tom for a bit. But in 1946, my drinking had gotten completely out of hand. I was a young woman with a young family. And in the case of a woman and a family, it is a very desperate thing. I couldn't keep going on the way I was. In early 1946, I made it to my first meeting over at the Top H meeting room in Walker Street in North Sydney. I was the first woman in AA, in Australia, to join AA as a member, but I was not the first woman to embrace the AA program. There were about a dozen people standing or sitting around the shabby little room to which I'd been led after stumbling up a rickety staircase in the dark. Looking around, I could see men whose bearing and strained expression told of years of misery and haunted loneliness. The group of women in the corner could be, to my way of thinking, the only brightness in that room. The picture of the women, the men, the room is stamped on my mind forever. Nobody ever spoke, but something told me, this is it. This is what you've been looking for. This is what you have thought was anywhere but where you were. I made my way over to that bright spot of brightness, the women in the corner, and was absorbed amongst them before I had time to feel any fear or suspicion.
They gave me my first glimmer of hope as they chatted about their husbands, laughing now of things that for a short time before had been a cause for tears and desperation. Yes, these were the wives of alcoholics, but so filled with hope and understanding that they could take me, an alcoholic, into their midst, not with hesitation or suspicion, but gladly, and I believe with love. They clustered around me, filled me with confidence so I could speak of my alcoholism just as if it were nattering about clothes. There were none there to look shocked or disgusted when I told of the mess my life was in. It was the first time I'd seen anyone laugh over incidents which had been so terribly tragic and a matter of great remorse to me. I couldn't understand it, but I was strangely comforted somehow. This was my first meeting, and although I have had time to experience many wonders in AA, this will remain the greatest one of all. We hear so much of what we alcoholics have to suffer and the way we make our way back to sanity, but not so much of how these women passed through all the misery with their partners, still hoping in spite of it all that something would happen to save this being who, fantastically enough, they still loved. I've seen them, as I say, extend their understanding to me, so because I also had this sickness which had stricken their husbands. AA has made a tremendous difference in my life. It gave me the inspiration to live, something I needed, but did not have. Everything about AA appealed to me and I loved it. I've never been one to argue about the various parts of the program. As it is written, it is meant for me. I found that everything it says, it does. From early on, I just wanted to help the next woman who was struggling like I had. I didn't care about the weather or how far I had to travel. I'd just get on the train and went. If someone needed a hand, I was there. And my husband, Guy, was always right behind me. He couldn't have been more supportive. He often came along to meetings with me and was always willing to help with the 12 steps I had to do, with the 12-step work I had to do. I can assure you, many a drunk has lain on our dining room carpet without my husband helping to nurse them. AA has meant a lot to our whole family. My youngest daughter said to me some years ago, "Mum, are you going to a meeting again tonight?" I said, "Yes." And she said, I don't know. If you haven't got Dad sober by now, you're never going to get him sober." What a wonderful thing it is that my daughter had been saved from knowing their mother was an alcoholic. Later on, I helped start the Hurstville group with Rex A and Fred R. That meeting is still going today. It's one of the oldest groups in the country. And that's how it was. I just kept turning up, doing my bit, and helping the next woman who needed it. The same as people that did for me. I do it out of gratitude for what AA has given me.
In June 1970, Betty was present at the Day of Recollection at Kirribilli Convent. After this, Serenity Bill drove her to Marrickville Station, where she took the train to Sutherland. Betty was admitted to the hospital the following day and passed away 2 weeks later on the 14th of June 1970. Her spirit lives on in the AA she loved so much. While Betty was the first woman to join AA in Australia as a member herself, she was stepping into a space where other women, the wives of alcoholics, had already been quietly holding things together. They were the bright spot in the room that Betty gravitated to at her first meeting. These were Lorna B, Dorothy J, Elaine E, Dulcie McKinnon, Gwen W. in Bunbury, WA. These women weren't alcoholics, but they were deeply affected by alcoholism and committed to the cause of AA. In those early days, they attended meetings alongside their husbands, offering support, making tea, and often helping to keep the meeting rooms running. In doing so, they found a common bond of their own. But over time, it became clear that they needed help too. Living with alcoholism had taken its toll on them, and they began to realise they needed their own kind of recovery. From this small group of dedicated wives, something remarkable began to grow, a fellowship of their own, which would eventually be known as Al-Anon. Tom Jacobs hosted a radio show called Salute to Life, which documented various aspects of life in Australia through interviews. He would sometimes interview members of Alcoholics Anonymous, but one day asked to speak to some of the wives of those members. On Friday, the 10th of January, 1947, he interviewed Dorothy J., wife of Railway Russ. Dorothy told his audience,
I can tell you there is a deep unhappiness that seems to settle over any family living with an alcoholic. It's a miserable business. Honestly, it's not something I would ever want to go through again. But these days, things are different. I would say that Alcoholics Anonymous is the answer for anyone with an alcohol problem. I've cut myself free of all lies, and besides having a sober husband, I've also been given something truly priceless, real friends, and that's a treasure indeed.
By 1954, two of the wives of Sydney AA members, Dorothy J. Russ and Edie, had reached out to Al-Anon Family Group's headquarters in New York, looking for help and support for themselves. In response, they received practical guidance and some literature to get them started. That same year, the very first Al-Anon meetings in Australia were held, one in Western Australia and one in Sydney. In the West, the early members included Gwen W., Bunbury Jim's wife, along with Bertha, Alla, Gertie and Grace. In Sydney, Dorothy J. and Edie were among the first to get things started. While the Western Australia group kept going, the Sydney meeting eventually folded. Even so, Dorothy kept in touch with New York over the next few years, determined to keep the connection alive. In the meantime, family members continued going along to AA meetings. In May 1957, Al-Anon in Sydney got going again, this time meeting in a church hall on Broadway. About 30 people came along to that very first gathering. Before long, meetings moved to the rectory of St Philip's on York Street, and later to the Den, the basement of the old St Philip's Hall. The Den became a much-loved and legendary meeting place for both AA and Al-Anon, though sadly it's no longer there. Today there are somewhere around 330 Al-Anon family group meetings held weekly around Australia.
AA's early days in Queensland have an almost legendary feel. It was very nearly the birthplace of AA in Australia, but it wasn't until 1947 that things really got going, thanks to some unforgettable people who heard the message and carried it with them for the rest of their lives.
The story of Alcoholics Anonymous in Queensland is one of the most intriguing. It seems that AA nearly took root in that state as early as 1941, some 4 years before our official 1945 birthday would have spoilt this party. In June of that year, Dr. Edward Derrick, then the Queensland Government pathologist, wrote to the Australian Medical Journal about Alcoholics Anonymous. He ended his letter with this striking statement: "The nucleus of an Alcoholics Anonymous group has been established in Brisbane." Adding to the mystery, copies of the Big Book were reportedly on sale at Barker's Bookshop on Adelaide Street in Brisbane as early as 1942, before Dr. Minogue even received his copy. But despite these early signs of AA activity, nothing seemed to hold. By the time AA gained a permanent foothold in Queensland a few years later, these early sparks had been all but forgotten. In 1947, while Lillian Roth was still performing in Australia, she had plans to visit Brisbane for a show at Her Majesty's Theatre on Wednesday, the 28th of October. While she was in Sydney and about to head to Queensland, she was particularly interested to learn that there was no AA in Brisbane. Things were about to change. At this time, Buster F., a Sydney actor who had worked extensively with the Tivoli theatre circuit and was now living in Brisbane, read of Lillian Roth's visit to Australia and her recovery through Alcoholics Anonymous. Curious to know more, he wrote to her, and Lillian replied, letting him know of her upcoming visit to Brisbane. The other person involved was Dan C., a well-known criminal defence barrister from Brisbane, whose career had been affected by his drinking. While in Sydney, Lillian was given his name by a nurse, Mary Elson Green, a family friend of Dan C., who said he might be interested in AA as he certainly had a problem. When Lillian arrived in Brisbane, she got in touch with both men. The day after her arrival, Buster visited Lillian and her husband Bert at the theatre. He spent much of her visit with them and agreed to act as a local contact for Alcoholics Anonymous in Brisbane. Meanwhile, Lillian also called Dan C., urging him to meet her at Lennon's Hotel. At first, Dan refused, later admitting,
"In 1947, I went on a bender, a real one. The kind where you go on and on without a second thought about food, sleep, or anything else. As long as I could still lift a glass to my lips, I kept drinking, day and night, until I couldn't anymore. Back then, I didn't believe alcoholism was a disease. I'd never heard of the idea. To me, drinking in a hotel was just normal social custom, something people did in every civilised country. My neighbours could go and have a drink without any trouble, so why couldn't I? But somehow, it never worked that way for me. I had plenty of friends who could drink to my health and then carry on with their lives, never making the same idiotic, reckless choices I did. I wasn't a daily drinker. I was a bender drinker and could go long periods, sometimes even 18 months, without touching a drop. But when the time came, I wouldn't get much warning. I'd be walking down the street completely sober, pass a hotel, and just like that, turn in and order a drink. And once I started, that was it. In 1947, around the same time, Lillian Roth was in Sydney performing a play that was set to move to Brisbane. She asked if there was anyone in Brisbane struggling with alcoholism, and a girl who knew me, who knew my habits, gave her my name and phone number. When Lillian arrived in Brisbane, she rang and asked me to come and see her at Lennon's Hotel, where she and her husband were staying. and I refused. Why? Well, because I was 47 years old and I thought I knew everything. I was an intellectual, and so I believed, and the idea of a glamour girl could have any effect on me, let alone get me off the grog, seemed utterly ridiculous. But my mother, my dear old mother, asked me to go out, and out of love for her, I agreed, just once. When I arrived, Lillian greeted me with a smile and said, "Come in, Dan. You're an old rum and so am I." We must have talked for hours, and during that conversation, something in me shifted. She made me think, and in that moment of thinking, it just changed everything. I'd been so sure that no woman could have an influence on me, the great intellectual. But what I actually wasn't intellect. It was vanity, arrogance, and sheer ignorance.
While in Brisbane, and as she had done elsewhere, Lillian continued giving public talks about Alcoholics Anonymous, speaking at churches and at Albert Hall on Sunday, the 9th of November, a talk that was even broadcast on radio station 4KQ. As in other cities, these talks attracted a lot of publicity. Dan C. attended one of her talks, likely on Sunday the 2nd of November at the Methodist Hall on Ann Street.
That night, Lillian spoke at the Methodist Hall on Albert Street. I gathered a few of my mates who I thought might benefit from hearing her, and we went along. But most of the audience that night were temperance people, folk who didn't see alcoholism as a disease at all. Still, those of us in the room who were alcoholics, we knew. We understood what she was saying. That was the beginning of AA in Queensland. After that meeting, 5 of us started gathering. One of those was Buster F., who was a well-known vaudeville actor. Buster had a show called Buster and His Talking Dog. Of course, the dog never actually talked. It was just a gimmick. More often than not, Buster would get drunk and miss the show entirely. But Buster was there at that first AA meeting in a little flat on Highgate Hills. Looking back, I'm deeply grateful. Grateful to you, and especially grateful to Lillian Roth. She may be gone, but she will never be gone from my memory. She'll never be gone from my gratitude. For taking me, just in one afternoon, from an arrogant fool to a humble follower of Bill W. and Dr. Bob.
The following Sunday, there was a gathering in Lillian's room at Lennon's Hotel where Buster, Snowy, a taxi driver, and Dan discussed how to get AA meetings started. It was the first time they had all met together, and that evening Lillian did a radio broadcast lasting 90 minutes about AA. The next morning, a group of newcomers accompanied Lillian and Bert to the 11 a.m. train to Sydney, from where they returned to the USA. Soon after, the small group who had attended the Lennon's Hotel meeting met outside the Tivoli Theatre. These were Dan, Charles, Mark, Snowy, and Buster. They proceeded to Mark's flat in Highgate Hill, and in early November 1947, to what was possibly the first Queensland meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous. They were now on their own, with little knowledge of AA and only a printed card of the 12 steps and the combined knowledge obtained from meeting with Lillian and Bert. As a result of Lillian's broadcast, they soon began to receive inquiries, and the small group began to grow. By the end of 1947, they had grown to 12, and a few months after that, there were 20 of them. As the group grew, Mark's flat became too small, and they looked around for other options, including meeting at Dan's barrister's chambers in the old Inns of Court. They were able to book a room upstairs in the City Hall. The history of Alcoholics Anonymous in Queensland began much like it did in other parts of Australia, through the persistence and hope of a small group of people determined to find a solution to their struggles with alcohol. Queensland is a testament to the power of community, hope, and the shared desire for recovery. Never go back for your hat. Buster F. remained sober and went on to star on radio and television, toured Vietnam to entertain the troops, and played Charlie in the cult classic Australian movie Wake in Fright. He would also play an important part in 12th stepping Barry H. of Dame Edna fame. Barry H. paid later tribute to Buster, remembering their first meeting in 1971.
My name is Barry, and I'm a very funny man. Also an alcoholic. Now, I will be referring to my notes, because even though I have mastered playing a number of characters, it's always been a little awkward just being Barry. I hadn't been in the clinic for thirsty people for more than a few days when a carer came in to tell me there was someone to visit me. Now, I knew it wouldn't be a family member because they had all wisely dropped me. It was someone called Mr. F, and he'd been waiting 2 hours for me to wake up. I'm too busy today to see anyone, I snapped a little implausibly. But Buster F appeared in the doorway. He was a famous old vaudevillian comedian, and he had lapsed into alcoholism and taken to sleeping in parks and railway sidings with a 3-cornered bottle, meths, for company. I had heard, God knows how, that he had sought the help of Alcoholics Anonymous and was a changed man. He was working too, in Australian soap operas and police dramas, playing derelicts sleeping in parks and railway sidings with a 3-cornered bottle for company. They were roles to which he brought a particular insight. Buster sat by my bed for about 60 minutes while I dozed. When the man who had waited 2 hours to see me finally left, he only said a few words. I reckon you'll make it, mate. Was it then that I first felt a glimmer of hope? 2 years later, when I had finally taken Buster's path to recovery, I was in London making a film about alcoholism called The Adventures of Barry Mackenzie. I strolled past the Coach and Horses in Soho. Norman Balon, the famous publican, spotted me through the window and invited me into the bar. Now, Buster had given me a piece of advice. If you get out of the lion's den, mate, he besought me, never go back for your hat.
Buster passed away on the 14th of January 1972. Barry H got sober in 1972, and he maintained his sobriety for over 50 years until his passing in 2023. Like many of us here today, he was deeply grateful to the early members who helped light the way. When Lillian Roth passed away in 1980, she was warmly remembered by the Australian Fellowship. Reverend Gordon Powell, who who helped establish the Melbourne group with her in 1947, paid tribute.
There must be hundreds of alcoholics in Victoria who owe their sanity and sobriety, if not their lives, to Lillian Roth.
The same could be said for alcoholics in Queensland, South Australia, and all across the country. Lillian's tireless effort and generosity left a profound and lasting legacy. She brought hope where there had been none and played a vital role in laying the foundations of the fellowship we are part of today.
Alcoholics Anonymous first took root in the nation's capital in 1952 when Mary M returned from Sydney after sobering up under the care of Dr. Sylvester Minogue. This was a moment that marked the beginning of another extraordinary chapter. The early days of AA in Canberra were filled with remarkable characters, unwavering determination, and a small but tightly bound fellowship whose courage and commitment helped light the way for generations to come.
Hi, I'm Mary and I'm an alcoholic. Thank you for that warm welcome. My husband Leslie was a baker in Queanbeyan, and when the war broke out, he enlisted and went to serve in Papua New Guinea, where he was killed in 1944 during the Battle of Shaggy Ridge. I felt his loss deeply and was left to raise our daughter Dorothy on my own with a war widow's pension. Even with this assistance, I struggled to make ends meet. My parents had already passed, so I didn't have assistance from family, but legacy was a lifeline for me during those years and helped me out. Although raised Catholic, the local priest never let me forget that I had married outside the church. He was hostile towards me, even suggesting I was responsible for my husband's death. I was so frightened of him that whenever he came around, I hid under the bed with my daughter until he left. To get by, I worked as a barmaid at the Queanbeyan Hotel next to the railway station, and also worked in similar roles in Sydney for a few years before returning home back to Canberra in 1950. I remarried, and my new husband was a public servant and a bookmaker, only in Canberra. We settled in Red Hill, and I was finding it more and more difficult to hide my drinking, and I'd really become quite desperate. Around 1952, I travelled to Sydney to get help and was treated by Dr. Minogue, who introduced me to the AA program. When I returned home, I got in touch with Billy B, who was another Canberran who had found sobriety in Sydney. Together with old Jack, the grazier, and Clem, a lawyer, we started a meeting in my Red Hill home. We organised a public AA meeting on Saturday, the 20th of June in 1953. Members from Sydney and Goulburn and other areas came along to support it, and there were many observers: the Chief Magistrate, Police Commissioner, clergymen, doctors, reporters, and members of the general public. It was a big moment. Before too long, we had moved the meeting from my house to the CWA hall on the corner of Barry Drive and Mort Street. It was known as the City Group, and we continued meeting there for 35 years until the hall was demolished. In Canberra's freezing winters, there was an unwritten rule. Every member would bring along a piece of wood to keep the fire burning at the meeting. The City Group's legacy continues to this day, as with AA meetings now being held at the church now it sits on the site where the old hall was. The AA program gave me a wealth of friends and an opportunity to have a life I could only dream of. After a few years of sobriety, I started a high-end fashion boutique in the heart of an upper-class suburb in Canberra and became a very successful businesswoman. My daughter and I remained close over the years, and just like it says in the big book, in return for a bottle and a hangover, I was given the keys to the kingdom.
The public AA meeting had helped to put AA firmly on the map in Canberra. Later in 1953, the Chief Magistrate, Justice Byrne, while presiding over a case, released John R., a chronic alcoholic, on a 5-year good behaviour bond on the condition that he seek help from AA. The Chief Magistrate spoke highly of the organisation, remarking,
"It is regrettable that much more is not known of that amazing organisation, Alcoholics Anonymous. It is unique. There are a growing number of alcoholics in the community, and here in Canberra, that includes some of our finest and most intellectual citizens. They are not weak or mentally depraved. Alcoholism is an illness, and there is no known cure that medical science knows."
By 1954, the Canberra Times reported that AA had been active in Canberra for 2 years and that up to 14 members were attending weekly meetings. Today, there are around 45 meetings in the Greater Canberra region each week.
On this, Alcoholics Anonymous kept on growing across Australia, reaching Tasmania in 1949 and the Northern Territory sometime in the 1950s. Today there are around 2,194 meetings held weekly in Australia. Everywhere AA has reached, there are incredible stories of hope, lives rebuilt, people defying the odds. These are the stories we still share with each other in meetings all over the country, and I never get tired of hearing them. But I can just about hear the loose change rattling in the baggy pockets of the blokes, which usually means we're getting dangerously close to resentment time. So sadly, that means it's time for us to wrap things up. We would like to offer our sincere thanks to Andrew Taylor for putting together this amazing play. To the wonderful cast who has helped bring this to life, to the host planning committee and to all of you. There are far too many people to thank individually, so we'll let the credits roll slowly. Make sure you go to the Old Timers meeting this afternoon. Some of them would have known some of these people mentioned today. Before we go, we'd like to make a small request. If you have any information, stories or materials that you could add to our history, please consider getting in touch with our archivist. Every piece helps us preserve the story of AA in Australia for those who come after us, and we'd be truly grateful for your contribution. Thank you.